Tá fáilte roimh go léir. Welcome everyone to Carlow College St. Patrick's. My name is Thomas McGrath, and on behalf of Carlow College, it is my pleasure to introduce today's public lecture, which is being given on English poetry with particular reference to the Leaving Certificate curriculum. Our lecturer today is Dr. Derek Coyle, lecturer in English in this college. He is a published poet and he also teaches creative writing. The title of his lecture, Sing Whatever Is Well Made, a close look at the poetry of Yeats, Rich and Bishop. Dr. Coyle lectures here in Carlow College on the BA Honours in English and History and on the BA and BA Honours in Arts and Humanities, which has the discipline of English within it. We are delighted that so many of you, over 1,000, have joined us today for this live-streamed lecture. Normally, we would have our nearby schools in this hall, but with the current strength of the pandemic, that is not really possible. We are delighted to be joined by schools, not just from here in Carlow and in the surrounding counties, but from all over Ireland, from Wexford to Kerry and from Donegal to Louth, and by people in various parts of the world. You're all very welcome to Carlow College St. Patrick's today. Dr. Coyle will speak for about 45 minutes, allowing 15 minutes for questions. I will put questions from the floor here to Dr. Coyle at the end of his lecture. This is the first of two lectures on the English poetry curriculum on this day fortnight, Monday the 29th of November at 1:45 p.m. Another of our English lecturers, Dr. Simon Workman, will speak on the poetry of Emily Dickinson and the unseen poem. So, without further ado, it is over to Dr. Coyle for today's lecture. Dr. Coyle.
Well, we have three fantastic poets, different and yet with some similarity because they're all working in the medium of poetry to look at this afternoon. It's my great pleasure to introduce you to these poets if you haven't read them before, and hopefully bring a fresh angle for those who know the poems very well. I should say, I feel like Christy Moore here today. You might remember the opening line of his song, Lisdú Bharna, where he says, welcoming everybody from Dundalk, Gortahorp, Glenamaddy, and all over the country. Donegal, I think, gets a mention in there as well. So very welcome to our online audience there from all around the country. I know the Galway people are going to be very interested because Cool Park features, which is in Galway. If you haven't seen it, go and have a look. I'm sure your parents, grandparents have encouraged you. And so on. So from Kerry to Donegal and Dundalk in between, you're all very welcome here today. So I'm going to begin, and before too long, I think we're going to really focus in on the poems. I can only really do a selection as kind of a sample and draw out some themes and pursue those. But I want to focus in, just check I have that switched on, which I do, but that is not moving for me for some reason. So I am going to ask for assistance there. And we will move on to the next slide. So there we go. Here's our three poems. That's what we're focused on. So anybody online, I know I have poets from Wales looking at us today. You can check out the Poetry Foundation website and you will get the Yeats poem and the Elizabeth Bishop poem. And if you type in very quickly the Adrienne Rich poem, you'll find that there as well. That's just for all the people online. But for those in the classrooms around the country, you can have a look at your textbooks. So there are the three sample poems by these poets that I'm going to look at. The Wild Swans at Cool by Yeats. We have Adrienne Rich's and Jennifer's Tigers. And we have Elizabeth Bishop's Filling Station. Giving you a nice image there of Cool Park, by the way, which is exactly where Yeats describes at the opening of the poem. I've walked it myself as you walk down to the lake there and so on. So we say one or two little things about Yeats before we read the poem. And then when we've read the poem, I'll talk to that and sort of extrapolate some ideas. One of the major things about Yeats, apart from the fact he's a huge poet in English-speaking language for the 20th century, many fascinating things about it, but one of them we'll focus on is his use of symbolism. Right? He turns things into symbols. He's very attentive at reading symbols and paying attention to them. And he's very, very good at turning what he writes about into a symbolically resonant artifact. And I will argue he's doing that in the Wild Swans at Coole. And I will want to argue that something similar happens in Adrienne Richards' poems and Jennifer's Tigers. She will actually turn the object she's talking about into a kind of resonant symbol, somewhat following in the line of Yeats, I would argue. Now, another major feature of Yeats that I think has some connection to Bishop is that he's famous for his Yeatsian talk. You know, we hear when we're reading a Yeats poem, especially as this mature style evolves, a man speaking passionately and intensely. We very much feel like we're hearing a speaking voice. And in Filling Station by Bishop, I think this will be very apparent that we're listening to a woman in this instance speaking to us. And I'd argue that that's partly a formal connection to Yeats. She picks up on the conversational tone that Yeats develops. Another connection, I think, with Bishop, as I will argue, is Bishop is stubbornly independent. She kind of does her own thing there in the middle of the 20th century and ignores some of the popular trends that were happening in poetry. And Yeats is somewhat similar in that regard. He kind of pursues his own line of vision no matter what's going on around him. He does listen and sharpen up in a few corners, but he never becomes truly modernist, for example, and he never fully abandons his Victorian roots. Even in the middle of the 20th century and so on. And he kind of sticks to his own way of doing things. So I think him and Bishop have that in common. Now, just to come back to the notion of Yeats's speaking in a conversational tone, which Bishop picks up on, Yeats is very influenced here by the Romantic poetic tradition. That's a big, big influence on Yeats there in the background, right? The Romantics are massive. He's a big admirer of Shelley, formerly, and others. And it was our old friend, I always feel sorry for somewhat, Coleridge, who evolved what we know now as the Romantic conversation poem. Coleridge in the Aeolian Harp and Frost at Midnight gets this speaking voice going, and he's talking you through an event that has happened or a moment as we journey with him, often physically or mentally, on a journey back to where we began, with a change after a crisis has been faced and so on. So that's the Romantic conversation poems. Poems on the Leaving Cert that take this form. Wordsworth's great poem, Tintern Abbey, is actually a version of this type of poem. And I know some of you honours students will be looking at Tintern Abbey. There is something conversational in Filling Station, but that other poem you're studying on the syllabus for your Leaving Cert, In the Waiting Room, is actually very close to that Romantic model of the conversation poem. She has an inner realization of her mortality and her belonging to the human race, and she starts somewhere, has that crisis in the middle of the tone, and resolves it by the end as she journeys in this inward meditation. So I'd argue that Bishop's In the Waiting Room is a late version of the Romantic conversation poem. And Yeats, I think we could argue, gives us a version of that in the Wild Swans at Coole. So they're my general overall comments. We might move on to the next slide there, and I'll just capture some of these points so you can take some notes there in the background. Anybody? I've mentioned Yeats's talk. I am going to argue when we look at the poem that his conversational tone is achieved through his very distinctive syntax, which means his grammatical logic. The way he sets up the grammar of his sentences and how he phrases them are slightly unusual, like a quirky individual with his own speech tics. You get the idea there, where that achieves the effect that you're listening to a unique and distinctive voice or personality. I will argue, I've mentioned already, he's a maker of symbols. I will argue that the Wild Swans at Coole is an example of this. And he loves antitheses, so two things in tension with each other that in the end he often doesn't finally resolve. It's also one of the reasons why his poems are so rich and why we enjoy them so much, is that we explore the tension without having it easily or readily resolved in the end. So it's kind of left open, which is interesting. I've mentioned already the Romantic legacy, his death to the conversation poem of the Romantics. So that's enough general talking about poetry. We have to get down to the specifics, which are always what matter when it comes to reading poetry. So I'm going to read The Wild Swans at Coole just to refresh it for us all and point out some of its distinctive features, as I put my watch in front of me, because that's important there. So The Wild Swans at Coole, a poem that Yeats wrote when he was 51. So he's a mature man at this point. That's important. He wrote it in 1916. To be published a couple of years later, 3 years later, in one of his first break books, really in the break last phase of his career, The Wild Swans at Coole in 1919. So here's the poem. The Wild Swans at Coole by William Butler Yeats. The trees are in their autumn beauty, the woodland paths are dry. Under the October twilight, the water mirrors a still sky. Upon the brimming water, among the stones, are 59 swans. The 19th autumn has come upon me since I first made my count. I saw, before I had well finished, all suddenly mount and scatter, wheeling in great broken rings upon their clamorous wings. I have looked upon those brilliant creatures, and now my heart is sore. All's changed since I, hearing at twilight, the first time on this shore, the bell beat of their wings above my head, trod with a lighter tread. Unwearied still, lover by lover, they paddle in the cold, companionable streams or climb the air. Their hearts have not grown old. Passion or conquest wander where they will, attend upon them still. But now they drift on the still water, mysterious, beautiful. Among what rushes will they build? By what lake's edge or pool delight men's eyes when I awake someday to find they have flown away? All right, so that's our poem, and I'm sure my students or our students and the Leaving Cert syllabus have studied the form of it and worked out the rhyming scheme and done all of that, which I don't need to remind them of. I would say it's very formally regular, and he sets up a pattern that he continues across the poem. So let's dip in, and I'm going to pick up on the effects of this conversational style. Just give you one small example. In the second stanza there, for example, it's the way he phrases it. The 19th autumn has come upon me since I first made my count. That's slightly inverted syntax. A more regular way to write that sentence in standard English would be, I first counted them 19 years ago. And you would start with, I first counted, with that verb at the beginning of the sentence. But Yeats twists the syntax around and puts it slightly further in, as if I'm a man just thinking this thought immediately, and I have my own quirky little way of speaking in the English language. That's one of the first things I'd say. Also, the way he counts out the 59 swans is slightly unusual there. And so that's one example, but you probably look in more detail, the first stanza, for that slightly inverted syntax. So we have a man talking, speaking in the poem. Now, looking at this symbol idea, he calls them the wild swans at Coole. So he has real birds before him. He's looking at the swans, but he calls them wild. Now, as the poem evolves, as we'll see, I'll make the argument that he's using that word wild in a double sense there. He means it in the initial meaning, which we take to be they're untamed creatures, they're out in the wild, they're not domesticated. But they can also take on, as the poem evolves, the meaning of wild in the sense of going wild, meaning letting go of one's passions and giving in to strong feeling. And I think as the poem ends, we'll have got a second sense there, and they'll start to resonate as the symbols. So this is a very distinctive feature of Yeats' style. He's a remarkable ability to think true symbols and to work with them. So how am I arguing that? Well, let's go to the second. Well, actually, we'll start in the first stanza. The trees are in their autumn beauty, so decay is in the air. We're transitioning into winter. The paths are dry. Okay, and for Yeats, dryness, we read several of his poems, means wisdom and death. But the water as it comes on is described as brimming. So it's full of energy and it's about to overflow. So that's contrasted with the dryness of the paths that is mentioned there. So the birds are associated with water, with energy, and perhaps Yeats himself observing the scene is, and he's older, he's 51, remember, he's with the autumn and he's noting the paths are dry. So that might set up some of the dynamic that we're arguing runs across the poem. Now he tries to count them in the second stanza, and he realizes that they fly away before he has them fully counted up. So I find that action quite interesting. There's the man trying to make sense of what's before him and putting some sort of order on it. My mind will be appeased if I can count what's before me. I somehow have control of the scene I'm viewing. But the birds up and fly away before he has a chance to do that, because they're not cognizant of his need to count. They're living free, let's say wild, and won't be accommodated by any human system of the imposition of meaning upon them, for example. So that happens there in the second stanza, we might say. And he gives a very visual and aural scene there. The birds suddenly mount, they scatter wheeling in great broken rings, and their wings are clamorous. So we can see that scene, and it is noisy as the birds take off and so on. Now, he's looked at the birds, these brilliant creatures as he's described them, and he notices that things have changed, hence the drama and the situation and his reception of it. He's got older, and lots of torment and so on has happened in his life. All's changed since I first heard them a while ago, a couple of years ago, but things have changed. So he's undergone change and suffering, actually, in the meantime. But they are unwearied still, he tells us in the second last stanza. So they maintain a vigor and energy in life that he is now missing. And now we see Yeats start to set up the antithesis that I would argue will take over the poem for now, between the energy and passion of the wild swans and the aging, decline and passionless existence of the older man. And now we're into the antithetical mentality that Yeats likes to explore. So they're unwearied lover by lover. Yeats is interested in sexual passion. They still have the energy that drives them on in life, which he misses. And so on. Their hearts haven't grown old, their hearts, the romantic center of their being, and so on. Passion or conquest, wonder where they will attend upon them still. So they still have that energy and power which he is missing and is longing for at this stage, and so on. So now we've got the antithesis in full play, as I would argue. Now they drift on the still water, they're mysterious and beautiful. He doesn't know in the future whether other men will look upon them and feel the same thing. Where will they build in the future? By what lake's edge or pool? They'll delight men's eyes when I awake someday to find they've flown away. They've left me behind and they've moved on, and they will continue their passionate existence somewhere else, as I grow old and decay and so on, you know? So that, I would argue, is the antithetical Yeats setting up tension, which by the end of the poem, he doesn't really resolve. He's just saying they'll have moved off, continuing their passion. I'll be here left decaying and getting old. And that's kind of his final statement, with the antithesis fully stated there and kind of left hanging. Now, when we read a good bit of Yeats's poems, we know that he prefers passion. He wishes he was a swan, and probably wishes he was younger, but of course there's nothing he can do about that. He can't turn back the clock of time. But even if life is confusing and bewildering, and even if love and conquest can be painful, he'd rather have that, because at least you're alive, than decaying into nothingness, as it were. So that's the Yeatsian polarity or tension set up there, and the birds taking on a symbolic resonance of youth and passion. They're animal and not human, and even though they're solitary out there amongst each other, they somehow defy him on the solitary shore, the human being longingly looking on the sea. He is old and he might be wise, but he is dry and facing his mortality, lacking the energy and vitality he might once have had, as he has undergone change. Okay, one or two little formal things maybe we could say about the poem, looking at the last stanza. I'd love his mysterious, beautiful, by the way. You will like that as a reader of poetry. It's divided by the medial caesura, as we call it. That's a good technical term for you, the middle break. And it sets up a symmetrical balance there at the end, balancing mysterious and beautiful either side of that medial caesura, as we call it. And that works with a dynamic of two. I would make the argument that he continues that, but among what rushes will they build, by what lake's edge or pool? We get that what repeated twice, which continues that dynamic of two, I would want to argue. And then he brings us in, strangely and interestingly, to the rhyming couplet that ends the poem. We have when I awake someday to find they've flown away, which is a rhyming couplet of two. So we've little small dynamics of two rolling in to build up that final quatrain, not quatrain, stanza, as it were. Okay, so Yeats develops his symbol, he develops drama, antithesis around that symbol, and he has a human reaction to a situation. Man walking out in the woods, he's undergone a process of thought, he looks at the scene, and he comes at the end, doesn't finally resolve it, I would argue, leaves it open, but he has at least set up the opposition and he's sitting there contemplating that. The great thing is he's inviting us into the poem and into the drama he has set up to enjoy it. Part of Yeats's attraction to us, actually, as he leaves that space open. And so on. So I think those are the major elements of that poem that should interest us. So we'll move on, I think, from Yeats, who's given us our bit of an introduction, and we'll have a look at Aunt Jennifer's Tigers here by Adrienne Rich. Now, the book was first published, she was very young as opposed to Yeats, about 22 or 3, born in 29, work out the maths there. 1951. Of course, she could have written the poem a year or two earlier when the book came out. Forward there by W.H. Auden. She was picked out as one of the young poets. It was a big competition used to run in America at that time. She wins it early on. Might be the first woman to win it. I could be lying there. Ashbury later on will win that prize. The Yale Younger Poets, that's what it was called. Very prestigious poetic prize in America at the time. Judged by W.H. Auden, very important English poet to live in America at the time. And Rich is chosen by Auden there for that. So I want to say just a couple of general things there. She is influenced, I would argue, in her whole approach in this poem by a very popular critical vogue at the time in the academy, the university, in the poetic world of the States and Britain. That's what we call the new critical influence. Now, very briefly, this was Cambridge professor I.A. Richards, writes a book on what we call new criticism, a phrase invented by the American John Crowe Ransom. William Empson in Britain is writing books and thinking in this style, writing poetry in that style. And then in the US, we've Alan Tate, Laura Writing, and John Crowe Ransom. So very quickly, what was this movement about? It was kind of a reaction to modernism, a kind of conservative reaction. And I know I have an artist in the room and she would know about academic art. They really generated a theory around what would become an academic poetry. So they admired lots of metaphor, very formal and sophisticated style, very much referencing other poetry, so that the professors would have a fun time explicating this poetry and saying how dense it was and so on. And of course, there's a danger of leading the average poet behind and the poetic audience, which was starting to happen. And we see a reaction actually against this kind of poetry, and we can see it and chart it out actually in Adrienne Rich's career. I think that's actually a very notable and interesting point about Rich. She kind of writes in that style for her first couple of books up to the 60s. I've had a look at the Leaving Cert syllabus there. About half of your poems belong to that phase of her career. And in the poem, for example, From a Survivor, which is coming from the early 70s, diving into the wreck, we actually start to chart a change in Adrienne Rich's style as she becomes much less formal, much more immediate, and much more accessible and direct. And that'll be the hallmark of her mature style as she has found herself. And Adrienne Rich will become a pioneer for 20th century poetry in English, as she blasts her way out of the shackles of new criticism and finds a way forward for poetry after that. Arguably, that's one way. Perkins, great Harvard academic, wrote a great 2-volume history of modern poetry, describes his poetry very well as the poetry of critical intelligence. You know, it's all about the mind enjoying and working out all the different allusions and references in the poetry. Hardly passion-filled and intense and moving poetry, one might say. Big poets that were admired in this tradition: John Donne, John Dryden, and it picks up on a strand in the academic writing and poetry of the modernist T.S. Eliot and so on. So that's roughly my setup really for some of the background of this poem. So this poem will be very formal. There'll be very little of the personality of the artists in the poem. Eliot had advocated an impersonal poetry, and there's a sort of third-person narrative being told to us here about Aunt Jennifer's tigers. But I'll argue for a connection, at least with Yeats, in due course. So let's have a listen to the poem. I'm sure everybody in our Leaving Cert syllabus are quite familiar with it. It's quite a well-known poem. I've watched interviews with Rich, and she talks years later, even as she discovered a new style, arguing how much she still enjoyed this poem of hers and she thought it was a good poem, and she's not wrong. So Aunt Jennifer's Tigers by Adrienne Rich. Aunt Jennifer's tigers prance across a screen, bright topaz denizens of a world of green. They do not fear the men beneath the tree. They pace in sleek chivalric certainty. Aunt Jennifer's fingers fluttering through her wool find even the ivory needle hard to pull. The massive weight of Uncle's wedding band sits heavily upon Aunt Jennifer's hand. When Aunt is dead, her terrified hands will lie, still ringed with ordeals she was mastered by. The tigers in the panel that she made will go on prancing, proud and unafraid. So I want just to point out a couple of things about this poem. First off, I want to maybe argue that she generates a symbol here. This tapestry or needlework that the aunt has made is expressive of something about her life. And Rich makes this poem about this tapestry or piece of needlework. So does it become a symbol in a sense that Yeats would understand and appreciate? Another way I might describe that is, does it become an extended metaphor? So she makes a comparison early on that something about the aunt's life is being expressed through the tapestry that she has created. And what is that? So the story of the tapestry reveals something significant about the life of Aunt Jennifer. And then it might become an extended metaphor, which might be a term for some of our Leaving Cert audience that they haven't heard before. So let's talk about two. A phrase I don't think I introduced in relation to Yeats that I want to actually connect here with Rich is the phrase tragic irony. Now, it might be a helpful phrase to describe something of what goes on in both poems, but with a slight difference, I would want to argue. But I'll come to why I think we could describe the poem as an instance of tragic irony in a moment. So I might just talk through and paraphrase a few bits and give you a general idea. Irony is when you have a gap between what's being said and what is actually true in a way. So Aunt Jennifer has used her creativity as a woman to generate this object, which ironically enough conveys her lack of freedom. She's trapped in a marriage with the uncle, all right? The tigers she creates in the artwork are joyous and happy, judging by some of the language she gives us in the poem. We'll look at that in due course. So they have a happiness that she's denied, but they are male like the hunters, which might be the significant point. And it's the woman who suffers and doesn't feature in the act of the work of art that she creates. It's a male-dominated piece of art. So the art doesn't speak about Aunt Jennifer or her life. Not directly. The argument is that it is in Rich's poem, writing about the making of this work of art, that the tragic irony is brought out. Okay, so how is that? Let's talk quickly through the poem and pick up how this is going on. So Aunt Jennifer, she makes this art object. She has the tigers on it, and they are prancing across the screen. Now, here's the importance of diction. The poet's choice of very particular words is very revealing. Prance indicates happy. You can't be prancing if you're constrained and unfree and miserable. So the tigers seem to be happy. They're bright topaz, which is a yellow. We get the Tiber color. Denizens, very technical word, meaning animals found in a particular place. In this instance, they're found here in this world of green, all very positive. So yellow and green, wonderful, vibrant colors. They do not fear the men beneath the tree, we might take to be the hunters who have their eye on them. They pace in sleek, chivalric certainty. So they are confident of where they are. And the interesting word is chivalric, you know, noble and elegant creatures, but very male. It was men who were knights and could behave in a chivalrous fashion. So still a very male-dominated world. Now, the story of Aunt Jennifer starts to come out as the poem goes along. Aunt Jennifer's fingers fluttering through her wool find even the ivory needle hard to pull. So she finds it hard to pull this needle. Fluttering might suggest being out of control slightly, not fully in control, and maybe something insubstantial. So her fingers are fluttering. And she finds the needle hard to pull. Why? In a moment of hyperbolic exaggeration, the next sentence, the massive weight. I mean, a wedding ring can't be that massive, you know what I mean? So it weighs her down. Now we know that Rich has to be thinking symbolically. The wedding ring drags her down, right? The massive weight of Uncle's wedding band. He owns the wedding band. So now we're into something like patriarchal society and its institutions are being discussed here. And it sits heavily weighing down Aunt Jennifer's hands. So it's the weight of marriage, the institution of marriage. And she's owned by the uncle. She's an object like the wedding ring that drags her down. Now this story is being told about Aunt Jennifer by Adrienne Rich in her poem. It's not to be found in the work of art that the aunt has left behind. When Aunt is dead, her terrified hands will lie, still ringed with ordeals she was mastered by. Right, so her hands are terrified, so she's not comfortable and relaxed. She's in a difficult marriage under strain and pressure, and this will impact on her body and leave her ringed even in death. It has been so intense, the mark, and she was mastered by this force. Master, very interesting diction choice there from Rich. She has been controlled and dominated by this force. The tigers in the panel that she made will go on prancing. We're back to prancing again, proud and unafraid. So I read that poem as nothing of her life has been expressed in her heart, right? We're left with a beautiful facade, but the real tensions behind it and the story of the person who made it is totally left off to sea. Right? Only it's brought in, of course, through Adrienne Rich, who's interested in that story and highlights it. Okay, formally, just say one or two things. Do find the poem interesting. Series of rhyming couplets set up in quatrains. Very unusual that she's gone for screen, green, tree, certainty. You normally would expect something like screen, tree, green, certainty. So that's formally unusual. And that, for me, in a way, is quite interesting. As an American poet, not surprised to see her drawing on anaphora, which is a rhetorical device where you repeat a phrase that's similar at the start of lines. So Walt Whitman, the great American poet of the 19th century, absolutely loved this device, was brilliant at it. And so many American poets give you a modulation on that formal feature. And in poems so different in style to what Whitman has written. So where's that? They do not fear, they pace. That small they. But even Aunt Jennifer's tigers, Aunt Jennifer's fingers, when Aunt is dead, a variation on it there, maybe at subtle little repetitions at the start of the line, an example of anaphora, rhetorical device, and so on. So let's return to the notion of tragic irony. Now, I would argue in Yeats's poem, The Wild Swans Are Cool, he gives us a situation of tragic irony, where a man's wishes are useless against the onslaught of the world. That's the tragic irony that I think Yeats sets up and explores in his poem. What we want, we don't often get. We wish to remain young, youthful, energetic, and passionate, but unfortunately, time catches up on us and we decay and grow old, and we can't change that. And that is the tragic irony Yeats sets up. The tragic irony in this poem, I would argue, is that the art made by Aunt Jennifer does not reflect the life of the woman who made it. It's tragically ironic. But what's different about the two types of tragedy, I think, is that Yeats's one grows inevitably out of the dynamics of human life. The tragedy of the tragic irony in Adrienne Rich is that this situation has been constructed by human society. And it's man-made, quite literally man-made. This could change. Women don't have to be trapped and imprisoned. We could alter that, and it was to change in time. But we see Adrienne Rich touch on this topic quite a bit, actually, in early poetry. Now, the poem is quite academic. It's very much written to a type of poetic formula. It's definitely got a clear style to it, the rhyming scheme, the quatrains, the way she develops this symbol and extended metaphor. It's the type of thing you see in John Donne, for example, and so on. And less of the personal speaking voice of the poet. No I appears. We learn very little about Adrienne Rich in this poem, as she hides behind the object she has created in a way. That will change with Rich in due course. But here she is influenced by one of the popular trends of her time. So now let's look at a different poet altogether. We might finish though on a later poem by Rich, where we can really see that change depending how we do. But I want to talk now about Elizabeth Bishop. I'm going to look at her poem, Filling Station there, which came out in a slightly later book by her. And I think with Bishop, she wrote very few poems, but they were very, very good, and they display remarkable variety. Right? Again, I think like Yeats, she was quite independent-minded and kind of did her own thing. Led her in her lifetime to be compared unfavorably to the great American poet of the time, Robert Lowell. But actually time has shifted things, and now his star has diminished and hers has very much risen, which is interesting, right? Which would surprise probably both of them if they could see. She avoids two dominant trends, actually, in the period. She avoids the new criticism that becomes a bit of a trap for Adrienne Rich and arguably Lowell, till he finds his way out of that. And then she avoids, though, the confessionalism which Lowell falls into, which he was a very good friend of hers. They wrote to each other for years. She could have pursued him into that corner. She had plenty to be unhappy about. She suffered from alcoholism. Her mother died very young and spent time in a psychiatric institution. There was plenty of torment around her to write about. She never wrote about any of that. She did her own thing. So she avoids the confessionalism, which is popular at the time. For Leaving Cert students and teachers, that's Sylvia Plath. Very popular from the 50s into the 60s. Robert Lowell, John Berryman. She avoids that and does her own thing. So in that sense, she's single-minded, pursuing her own art with independence and strength of character and conviction. In that sense, I think she's a bit like Yeats. Now, arguably then, one of her key techniques, which you'll see in Filling Station, you'll also see it in The Fish, which is on the Leaving Cert syllabus this year, beautiful poems by her, is she seems to build up the poem through observing little details, right? So she creates this kind of interesting and fascinating sense of naturalism, that she's just looking at the scene. And she avoids the conventions, the obvious sense of building towards a plot that we might expect. We never quite know where she's going. And it makes her poems very fresh and very distinctive. Now, she will do this in a conversational manner in Filling Station, and that's where I connect her back to Yeats and Yeatsian talk. Only it's a woman speaking we hear in this poem, but there is a guiding voice taking you through Filling Station, as we'll hear. And it's a woman's voice noticing things of interest to a woman, which would make it quite distinctive from Yeats. So she is in this conversational style that I identified with Yeats and can trace back to the romantic conversation poem. And we can see Bishop as a late romantic in that sense. So I'll tell you what, we'll have a read of Filling Station. We'll point out a few things that I hope make my case for this is her style and approach. So here's Filling Station, beautiful poem. Filling Station by Elizabeth Bishop. Oh, but it is dirty, this little filling station. oil soaked, oil permeated to a disturbing overall black translucency. Be careful with that match. Father wears a dirty, oil-soaked monkey suit that cuts him under the arms, and several quick and saucy and greasy sons assist him. It's a family filling station, all quite thoroughly dirty. Do they live in the station? It has a cement porch behind the pumps, and on it, a set of crushed and grease-impregnated wickerwork. On the wicker sofa, a dirty dog, quite comfy. Some comic books provide the only note of colour, of certain colour. They lie upon a big dim doily, draping a tabaret, part of the set, beside a big hirsute begonia. Why the extraneous plant? Why the tabaret? Why, oh, why the doily? Embroidered in daisy stitch with marguerites, I think, and heavy with grey crochet. Somebody embroidered the doily. Somebody waters the plant, or oils it, maybe. Somebody arranges the rows of cans so that they softly say so, so, so to high-strung automobiles. Somebody loves us all. Okay, it's a really, really beautiful poem, I think, and a poem of remarkable observation. Now, the first thing I'd say about it is I do think it's a poem of two parts, right? So part A, if we call it that, is the first three stanzas, from "Oh, but it is dirty" down to "The dirty dog, quite comfy." She's describing a scene there, and it's very much a scene where men are busy in the petrol station, and the female, and I do think we can't escape it, is a female observer, is thinking, do they live here? Is this where they work and live? Is her question. Now, the second part of the poem, I would argue, the next three stanzas begins with "Some comic books provide the only note of colour," and that's the change in transition. She starts to notice that there are essentially feminine elements and signs about the place. And she starts to work towards the notion there's a woman somewhere in these men's lives. We never see her, but she's seen the traces and the signs. And the woman is the civilizing influence, and she brings humanity and comfort, actually, to the stark world of men, is ultimately where the poem goes, I would argue, right? And that is her revelation by the end. But she's purely got there by building up and noticing details and asking questions about them. It's quite remarkable. So let's pick up on the tone of conversation. It's there from the first line. "Oh, but it is dirty." Only a person speaking could say that. And we hear the voice. I've noticed some dirt about the place. Well, it's possibly a woman rather than a man. This filling station, slightly odd syntax there then, this a bit like Yeats in that sense, you know, a little filling station, oil soaked, oil permeated. Anyway, she goes on, but then be careful with that match. I can only a person speaking, and it's giving you an instruction. Don't throw that match away, set the place on fire, right? That is a person speaking directly to us. And even then, father wears a dirty. Right, so a woman knows, so there's the father, and he's dirty, and she's speaking at that point. Now, she does use twice in the poem parentheses. Now, what I call, that's your brackets, right? And they're intimate parentheses, where she's giving you a word on the side. That's a real feature of human speaking, right? So first one is several quick and saucy and greasy sons, a system. It's a family filling station. She's just letting you know, there you go, on the side, there's a family here. She's telling you, oh, all quite thoroughly dirty. You hear that tone there of a little bit of mild disgust, and oh God, I wouldn't want to touch any of them or that scene, and so on. Now, she has slightly a longer parenthesis later on, and she says, embroidered in daisy stitch with marguerites, I think. There you go, I have the I think. I'm thinking to myself out loud. I'm not fully sure. I'm speculating, right? So that creates that immediacy of a voice speaking, as I would say. Okay, so she has this conversational tone that we've recognized from Yeats there as well. So I really admire the way that she's achieved that, and also how she's built up her poem by just observing objects, you know, things, the suit, a porch, a wicker sofa, a dog. She starts to shift with comics. They're not working all the time. They must have a sense of humor, these men, you know, and that's the shift. Then she's on to the feminine elements, the doily, the tabaret, a plant, begonia, and even the oil cans are lined up and look like a bit of thought has gone into them. They've been civilized and organized, right? So the men are seen, the fathers and the boys, but the woman is unseen, but she must be there. I can see the signs. There's a civilizing influence here. There's feminine domesticity at play. And Bishop notes the signs of that and picks up on it and wonders about it, or repetitions of the why there. Conveying, by the way, a tone of voice as well. Why the extraneous plant? Why the tabaret? Why? Oh, why? The toilet. She's kind of thinking that there to herself. So Bishop fond of cozy domestic scenes. Humans can domesticate the landscape. We've made ourselves at home on planet Earth, and we've kind of built a civilization, a world of coziness to kind of live in, is her statement, we could say there. Okay, so that was our quick walk through our three major poets. I hope I've illustrated a couple of useful points about them. I will finish with a quick reading, I think, and with a few comments on the Adrienne Rich poem for Leaving Cert students to pick up on the idea that she evolved and developed, and you can trace that actually in the poems that you have on your Leaving Cert. So Aunt Jennifer's Tigers represents that early style of Adrienne Rich. Now, she's very good at that, by the way. She's written some very beautiful poems in the new critical style, let it be said. But she evolves by the mid-70s under the influence of radical feminism, I would argue be one of the major ones, into finding a looser, more personal style. And for us, that's represented by her poem, From a Survivor. She's talking about escaping from her marriage, the death of her husband years ago, and discovering a new life with a woman, as it turns out, and suddenly living more freely by the 70s and more like the way she wants, with more autonomy. And I think it's formally expressed in the poem. I'll give you a few pointers on that. So we're just going to finish our talk on this poem there now, and we're on to questions then. That was our last slide, really. So here's the poem, From a Survivor. The pact that we made was the ordinary pact of men and women in those days. I don't know who we thought we were, that our personalities could resist the failures of the race. Lucky or unlucky, we didn't know the race had failures of that order and that we were going to share them. Like everybody else, we thought of ourselves as special. Your body is as vivid to me as it ever was. Even more, since my feeling for it is clearer. I know what it could do and could not do. It is no longer the body of a god or anything with power over my life. Next year, it would have been 20 years, and you are wastefully dead, who might have made the leap we talked too late of making, which I live now, not as a leap, but a succession of brief, amazing movements, each one making possible the next. As you see, she stated that to 1972, and that's from her breakthrough volume. I do think it's a huge breakthrough volume for Adrienne Rich. Julie celebrates why she's on your Leaving Cert in a way, diving into the wreck, where she discovers a much more personal voice and she speaks more clearly to her experience. And very much as Perkins would call her, the major poet of feminine consciousness, bringing a woman's way of thinking to poetry in the world. So a couple of pointers on that. I think it's a poem of 3 sections. I'd argue section 1 runs from the pact that we made to that line that's out on its own. Like everybody else, we thought of ourselves as special. You trace that through the pronoun. She uses I and we, but it's mainly we. She's talking about her and the husband all the way through. She moves it in the next section. Your body is as vivid to me, as she speaks directly to the deceased and ex-husband directly with that your, that shifts down to or anything with power over my life. Could argue that there's a third section that next year it would have been 20 years as the poem is starting to head towards its end and she needs to resolve it and so on. Now, the breakthrough style, where does it lie in this poem? Well, a couple of things we've noted already. There is no symmetry in her verse structure as she goes from 2 lines to 3 lines, 3 lines, 1 line, 2 lines, 2 lines, 3 lines, 4 lines, 3 lines, 1 line. Right? So that's a woman that's well able to do all that, but she just hasn't done it here. We saw it. She can't do it now, Jennifer's Tigers. So the form is broken open and it's much more personalized to what she wants to do with it and how she improvises it for her subject, right? Her stanzas are irregular, we could say, and there's no full stop in the entire piece. Right, so no punctuation of that order, but apart from the odd comma here and there where she needs them, but she omits them. Creating a casual style and a sense of a voice, improvising and speaking to the moment more directly, I would say. But I tell you what, I think we'll finish on that one there. But watch out, Leaving Cert students, you can divide the poems you have in the Leaving Cert into those before diving direct and those after, and you will see that difference, I think, very clearly, and that will be very helpful. She paves the way forward then for women poets, I think, and finding a more personal, relaxed, easier style to manage than that new critical beast that had sat on poetry's shoulders from the 30s up until the 60s, I would say, thereabouts. Okay, so we're very good. I think Tom McGrath, I have a few questions for you there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Coyle, for that great lecture. A couple of questions here from the floor. How vital is the manner in which the poet expresses his or her ideas, the poetic conventions that he or she chooses, the form the poem takes?
Okay, so Tom was asking me, why do poets go to such trouble to put form and shape on their poems? Well, and how vital is it? Yes, it's one of the major factors that makes poetry, I would say, and also gives you important signals about what the poet is doing. So we've seen that in that comparison of the two rich poems. So there's something constrained and very impersonal in that first poem, Aunt Jennifer's Tigers, but when she breaks up that form and loosens it out, she can speak more casually and more openly, and that's how we hear the voice coming through. But it's that freer poetic vehicle that allows her to speak that way that she's kind of found and broken out for herself. Now, one of the arguments about the danger, of course, is that you end up writing diary entries. And that has been the danger of poetry from rich on in that style, is that if I write down any lines at all about the tragedy of my life, I've written a poem, right? And that may not be enough, right? Now, where Yeats is protected, and actually Robert Lowell later on is, Yeats knows an awful lot about meter and poetic forms and so on. And even where he breaks that open and disrupts his syntax and so on, you'll see that in the Wild Swans are cool. He still keeps the poem moving along as a poem. So one of Yeats' great achievements was to actually write highly structured, rigorous, recognizably conventional poems and actually maintain the sense you've got of a passionate, intense man speaking to you through these forms. And that actually is part of his greatness and his legacy and why we can admire him so much, right? So recognizably poetry, but very much feel we've got a personal address from a man speaking to us from the dramatic situation he has set up. Robert Lowell does that actually quite well as well, let it be said, even in his more relaxed confessional poems of the 50s. I hope that answers your question there, Dr. McGrath.
A couple of other ones, Dr. Coyle. You've dealt with Yeats, Rich and Bishop. Is the gender of the author of a poem important?
Yes, I would say ultimately. I mean, we could say when we read Aunt Jennifer's Tigers that we don't hear a she or a woman speaking, but in terms of its subject matter and the way we've read the poem, this is a woman writing about the constraints and difficulties of marriage. It's very much indicating a female point of view, so we can't avoid that necessarily. Same in the Bishop poem. I think she is making it very clear, even though our poem is recognized to be a poem with stanzas and so on, and very subtle rhymes running through it. The perspective is very much that of a woman, and it's a woman noticing what a man might miss. And the important thing is that she's made that a subject of poetry. She has shown how I can make wonderful poetry out of a woman's point of view. Now, that might seem an obvious thing to say these days, but that wasn't taken for granted in the 1950s. So she's shown a woman brings something distinctive to the art form, and it's important. And look what was missing for so long, we could argue. So I would say that is an important question, and we can't avoid it looking at the two poems that we wrote there, or we've looked at there today by our two women poets anyway, Dr. McGrath.
Derek, why are specific details vital to a poem's success?
Okay, excellent, Tom. So Tom is asking, why do poets give us very tangible and recognizable details? I think that's a good tip for any of our poets in the audience. I'm going to point out what I think is a weakness actually in that poem by Adrienne, which that's my view. Feel free to disagree. And by the way, Lindsay Stewart's poems aren't holy sacrosanct texts. We can argue over whether we think bits of them work or they don't, you know. I'm not fully persuaded by that line of the second stanza there. Our personalities could resist the failures of the race. I just think that's a massive statement. What are the failures of the race? Which race is she talking about? And there's so many possible failures. Now, she'll go on to talk about is about marriage and the ability of a man and woman to live together. But still, the phrase is very big and a little bit vague, I would say, generalizing and a bit abstract. Now, that's generally the enemy of poetry, which likes the concrete detail. And that's one of Bishop's great strengths, where she really lets you see what she's seeing. And the poet as a sharp observer of a scene and noticing things and drawing conclusions from that are building up a picture. So you can't do that in general terms. You really need specific details to say something. As it were, and she's doing that very well, Bishop, in her doily and the tabarets matching with something else of a scene. That's a woman's thinking, or a more feminine aspect, if it were to be of a man, if you take that to be that, of domesticating a scene and making it more homely and so on. So specific details. Yeats tells you, well, he tries how many swans he counted the last time. He's gone to that trouble of letting you know. So poets do like details. Dr. McGrath, I hope I've answered your question there.
I think you have, but I have another one for you. What makes poetry different from the novel or drama or a movie? What can poetry do that these other genres can or cannot do?
Okay, good man, Tom. So what's very specific about poetry? Why do we have poetry still when we could make a movie or we could tell a story in a big novel? So I would argue that one of the major achievements of poetry is its condensing capacity, right? Capacity to say an awful lot in a very small space, right? So, and indirectly, right? And that's what Bishop picked that example of her poem has done. She has laid out a story for us and a wider story somehow through just noticing small details. So poet's capacity for intensification. I would also say that poetry is probably the most aware of the sonic capacities of language compared to film, for example, or a novel. So poetry listens to sounds and pays attention to them. So that's done in a rhyming scheme, for example, and where every word matters. So I picked out, for example, let's just pick that example, Aunt Jennifer's Tigers, and I said the word prance with all of its connotations is vital to what that means in the poem. When we looked at the word wild in front of Swan and Yeats, we gave it two possible meanings by the time the poem was finished. Now that type of dense elaboration on the possible meanings of one word is something that poetry does quite easily, actually, and other genres probably find quite hard to do. So an attention to the nuances and the levels of communication possible through language is probably poetry's distinctive forte, or at least one of them anyway, I would argue. So yeah, the first art form, Dr. McGrath, and the last, I would say. Well, I'm not sure about drawings, but anyway.
A final question for you. Is the poet a specifically gifted type of person beyond the achievement of most of the rest of us?
Right. From a man who appreciates Mozart and Beethoven, Tom, that's a very romantic question, by which I mean the romantic tradition of interpretation. The romantics would go with you on that one, Tom. Yeats probably believed it. And Yeats famously wrote, "We were the last romantics." And I argue from early on he was influenced by the romantic legacy. Do you think that's the romantic way of looking at things? It's deeply embedded in our culture, and increasingly we're actually thinking about the limitations of that way of thinking. So one way I would go at this is, for example, to say that Yeats is an inheritor of the romantic conversation poem. He didn't invent it. He couldn't have written The Wild Swans at Coole if Coleridge hadn't written that poem earlier, if it hadn't influenced Wordsworth in the writing of Tintern Abbey. And Bishop wouldn't have been able to write In the Waiting Room if that lineage hadn't been set up, but she's an inheritor of that as well. So there are limitations to the personal eye as we encounter our great forebears in any art form that we work in. And we're involved in a conversation with other artists and as we communicate forward onto others of the future. So it's an ongoing conversation in which the individual ego has a part to play, but it doesn't dominate the conversation. It'll continue on without them or regardless, Ada said. So I think actually we'd be more critical of that type of approach, Dr. McGrath, today than we might have been in the past, along the lines that I've been suggesting there. So I hope that answers your question. So Dr. McGrath, I'll hand the microphone over to you. I think we're good to go. Thank you very much, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that quick walk through a couple of important poems.
Thank you very much, Dr. Coyle, and I'm sure you'll all join with me in a round of virtual applause from whatever part of Ireland or the Western world you're in. Thanks to our very engaging lecturer. It was a splendid, brilliant lecture, full of interesting insights and delivered with such an effortless flow of words and poetry, and it really conveyed Dr. Coyle's enthusiasm for the subject, which we know so well in this college and in the whole southeastern region. Please join us again at the same time, 1:45, in 2 weeks' time, when another of our English lecturers, Dr. Simon Workman, who directs the BA Honours in English and History here and teaches on the BA and BA Honours in Arts and Humanities, will speak on reading the poetry of Emily Dickinson and the unseen poem. What is poetry and how do we understand it? So a second look at Leaving Cert English poetry with Dickinson and the unseen poem, getting a close scrutiny. So thank you all for joining us today via live stream and in person. Do email us and we will be happy to follow up with you on any aspect of these events and today's lecture. If you are not familiar with us, do check us out on the Carlow College website. So that concludes this meeting. Slán a Gaibh go léir.